Good evening. This is Matthew Tilley. Despite appearances to the contrary, I am Matthew Tilley. I did shave my face for those of you that might remember that and are paying attention. But Matthew Tilley here, and this is a somewhat weekly broadcast that I put on here for as a Bible study. Right now, we're looking through the Gospel of Mark, and we're in Mark chapter 10 tonight. And I call this Seeking Christ in the Scriptures. That's the little head or line there below, Seeking Christ in the Scriptures. And the reason for that is we want to see what the Bible says about Jesus, because I believe that every page in the Scriptures points us to Jesus, either something we're missing, something he's providing, something we need, something we crave, something we were created for, that those answers are all found in Jesus. So that's why it's called Seeking Christ in the Scriptures. Thank you for taking some time to join me this evening. Maybe you're on here live. There's a few of you that are on here live. Thank you for taking some time to do that. And some of you, I know, just because of the way life is and things are busy, you might have to join me later, and that's fine. This is on Facebook and YouTube. It's recorded, and you can catch it just anytime you'd like to. So either way, if you're live or if you're watching it later, do you mind dropping me a note? Just maybe hit a comment on Facebook if you're in here, or if you wanted to send me an email or a text message or any of that, that'd be great. Just like to know that you're here. Especially after you listen to this, if you get anything out of it or have a question or comment. I always think that things like this are better, or rather even best, if it's a two-way conversation. Certainly I can tell you what's on my mind, things I've been thinking about, things I've studied, but I think it's even better if you're involved, you get your questions asked, maybe not answered, but at least we can have a good, healthy discussion about it. So glad to do that. But anyhow, I hope you're doing well on this November night. So officially over a year since I've been doing this broadcast. I guess in a 52 plus weeks, I probably have done this 27, 28 times. So and a lot of you have been here almost every week. So thank you for that. But anyhow, we're gonna get into the study tonight, and it's an interesting study because we're in Mark chapter 10. That's where we'll be, Mark chapter 10. We're just going to look at the first 12 verses. But I want to notice here, I want to sort of, what to say, as they say, the elephant in the room as you read through this, especially in our day. And this is not new, as in 2023. This has been an issue for a long time in American culture. That's the world that I know. And that is, Jesus is talking about divorce. That's specifically what he's talking about. And I don't want to avoid that at all. A little bit, maybe, but no, seriously. It's not, I don't want to avoid the fact that he's talking about divorce. We'll talk about what he says about divorce. But I want to make sure as we're looking at this, that you look at it through the lens of, or in light of, what the Gospel of Mark is about, what this section of Mark is about. And I think as you do that, certainly you will learn what Jesus's point of view on divorce specifically is. We'll learn that. But I think more than that, not just about divorce, but what is Jesus trying to teach us about being his disciples? Because I really think it's the overall emphasis of the Gospel of Mark, is being a disciple, a follower of Jesus. And I believe this specific section, which started about chapter 8 and goes for another chapter or two, this really the center of the book of the Gospel of Mark, is what it means, what it takes, what it's about to be a follower of Jesus, what that means, what that's all about. So we're going to try to look at it through that lens. And along the way, because Jesus is our teacher, he is the one we are following. As we listen to him, we're going to learn about his teaching on specifically divorce. That's what he talks about in this passage. Before I go any further, I want to stop and do what I try to do every time that we get together, and that's pray. And again, I'll tell you, just want to make sure I'm very plain with you all. There's two reasons I do this. One is I need prayer, I need help. But second reason, and I tell you this because I'm hoping if you're listening to me teach you, that I teach you one thing, we can't know the scriptures apart from the author, and we need his help. So I'm asking you to join me in prayer as we begin the study of his word. Father, I do want to teach your people about Jesus. I want to teach them about what he teaches us, and I want to teach them how to follow him, but also what it means to follow him, who he is. And I pray that that becomes clear to everyone, that you will help me to be honest, appropriate, helpful, and most importantly, follow Jesus myself more and more every day. I ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. If you've got a Bible, got a copy of God's word, I would encourage you to pull that out, open it up to the Gospel of Mark, look in chapter 10. And I'm just going to read verses 1 and 2 just to begin starting here. So in verse 1, it says that he, speaking of, this is Jesus he's talking about in verse 1, he, Jesus, arose from thence. So where he was teaching prior to that in chapter 9. But he says he left that place and cometh into the coast of Judea by the farther side of Jordan. And the people resort unto him again. And as he was wont, he taught them again. So simply setting the scene, and Mark's just setting the scene that Jesus is going from one place to the next. And as he's going, he's teaching. Again, think about this through the lens of Mark trying to tell us what it means to be a disciple or follower of Jesus. We need to understand that everywhere Jesus went, yes, he did lots of things. He healed. He was showing himself to be God. But the number one thing he did was he would teach. He would show them what it means. By the way, later on at the end of his ministry, as he's about to ascend into heaven, Jesus gives us the Great Commission. And one of the things that he tells us as followers of Jesus is we are to teach all nations to observe the things that he taught. That's in Matthew chapter 28, verses 19 and 20. You'll see that he tells us to teach people to observe, to do, to obey the commands that he taught. So here's Jesus going about teaching. And then in verse 2, as he's teaching, listen what happens. The Pharisees come to him. Now, y'all know the Pharisees. If you don't, let me just give you the headline on it. For all intents and purposes, these are the religious leaders of the day. Now, these guys had a specific point of view. They were Jewish. They were observant Jews. They really strictly followed the law. In fact, to a point where they would add some structures to the law so that they would protect the law. Well-intended, let's be honest, they were very well-intended. Sometimes they get painted as some kind of boogeyman or something like that, but really these were well-intended people. I think their hearts were right. They were trying to do the right thing, but they were blinded when they were standing in front of Jesus Christ. It's kind of a warning to me and you. I just wonder, we will not be able to test this on this side of eternity, but I do wonder if Jesus were to show up in our churches today, in my church, in your church, would he be accepted, or would we treat him like the Pharisees did? Well-intended, good people, religious people, but when you see these guys, they were against Jesus every step of the way. Ultimately, these were the men who would gang up together and railroad him through a mock trial. I mean, like a mockery of a trial, and ultimately get him condemned by the Roman government so he would be hanging on a cross. So come back to the passage. These guys, that's who these people were. They come to Jesus and they ask a question. Is it lawful for a man to put away his wife? And then Mark adds these words, tempting him, saying, they asked the question, is it lawful for a man to put away his wife? And Mark says, hey, they were tempting him, trying to bait him. These are the religious leaders of the day, and they are testing Jesus. They're trying to feel him out, and they're feeling him out about, it says there in the King James that I'm using here, it says they're putting away his wife. That's what he's talking about. That's a phrase that we today would say, is it lawful? Is it legal? Is it right? Is it moral for a man to divorce his wife? That's what they would have been saying. The King James just uses the language of putting away his wife. That's what they're saying there. But they're testing Jesus. They're kind of seeing where he's at on this thing. They're kind of putting it's a litmus test in their mind, because what was happening is in this, just like today, and by the way, it seems like these kinds of questions continue to bother humanity, but there's kind of two camps. And this is true, I believe, in my religious experience, church experience, to this day. There's two camps when it comes to divorce. There are some people who would say No, no, there's a hard line. Never, never, never. In fact, if you almost to the point where, I mean, I hope they're not this way, but I hope, but some people are. They're to the point where if you've been divorced, that somehow you're less than, or there's something sinful or wrong with you. There's a very hard line take. And then there's more of what you might call a soft line or a liberal take, where, oh, any reason whatsoever. And it seems like there's rarely, even though reality tends to live in the middle of that, rarely the positions that people take are on either they're one or the other, except there's not very many in the middle. So they were testing him to say, just like today, in that day, they had those two camps. There were people who would take a hard line and say, there is no reason whatsoever you should ever divorce. And there's something wrong with you if you don't. And they would say, if Jesus took that line, then he's more, they would associate him. And by the way, I'm not saying that John the Baptist agrees with that, but they would have put him in the same camp as John the Baptist, because you remember John the Baptist, he was the man who spoke truth to power. This is in Mark chapter 6 and verse 18. He spoke truth to power. He told Herod, listen, you have an immoral relationship with who was essentially his sister-in-law. You have an immoral relationship with her, and you need to get out of that relationship. And those sort of moral that sort of moral stand of what is right and what is wrong, they were trying to say, Jesus, are you in that camp? Are you like John the Baptist? Are you one of the hardline folks who would say never, 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 no divorce? Or are you like there's another camp of religious people that they would call the Herodians, and the Herodians would have been, we would call them, again, my fundamentalist background, we would have called them liberal compromisers or something like that. That's what they would have tended to be associated with. And they would have been, in terms of this divorce, they would have been okay with what we today call no fault divorce. So just come up with a reason, can't live together, don't like each other, whatever the reasons are, you can be divorced. Now, I'm giving it to you through the 2023 modern United States of America cultural perspective. One wrinkle to all this, which you'll see when Jesus talks about his answer to this, is unlike in our world today, where there is at least legal equality between men and women. In that day, there was not. There was not. So when we're talking about divorce here, it was largely, can a man, in fact, even the way the question is asked, can a man divorce his wife? There was not even a thought about a woman divorcing her husband. That was just not even in the question, because women just didn't have the same legal standing as men. And again, I think that was wrong. I think Jesus, you'll see his answer here, he kind of condemns that, I believe, as well. But anyway, what happens is they're doing this test. Are you this side or this side? And they take these two extremes. Which one are you? And by the way, this is not an unusual trap. People do this in today in a lot of places. I hear this on the homosexuality question. The question is, do you hate homosexuals or do you love homosexual lifestyle? And I don't think the answer is either of those things. I don't hate anyone for any choice that they make necessarily. At least I shouldn't if I'm a Christian. But I don't have to say, on the other hand, that your sin is good. And the same thing, like abortion is another question. I mean, I know these are hot button topics, but that's the reason I bring them up. Abortion. Do you hate women and don't want them to have any rights to do anything? Or would you be okay murdering children for any reason whatsoever? And again, the answer is neither of those things. It's that age old joke, which I can never tell appropriately, but it's that question where the politician gets the question of, have you stopped beating your wife yet? Well, that assumes that there's a problem there. There's no good way to answer that question other than to say, no, wait, I was never abusive to my wife. Why are you asking me that? Same thing here. They sort of categorize. They want to put Jesus in a box. They want to say he's this or he's that, and it's categories that they have in their head. And I believe in the same way as we say, I want to follow Jesus, I want to be a follower of Jesus, we want to put Jesus in our box, in the categories that we have in our mind. Maybe it's political. He's a political conservative or political liberal. Maybe it's denominational. He was a Baptist, or he was a Presbyterian, or he was a Lutheran, or whatever your categories are. But the thing is, Jesus does not fit into a predetermined box. In fact, I know Jesus knew that they were trying to do that to him. So you'll see his answers to this. He's not the kind of teacher that you and I imagine that he is. He is exactly who he is, and he's not shaping himself to our desires or even our categories in any way. First thing I want you to see is that Jesus is a what I'll call a no loopholes teacher. See, what I want, and what most of you want, is a teacher who will teach me how to do like the right things, but he will give me some ways to wiggle around it so I don't feel bad about things. Jesus doesn't give that to us. Look what he does. So they've asked in verse 2, is it okay to do this? Verse 3, he answers, listen to his question, what did Moses command you? Now, that may not mean a whole lot to you and I because we don't necessarily go back to Moses. We go to Jesus. Moses is a prophet that they would have held in high regard. And he was the one, if you know your Old Testament, he was the one that brought the law of God to God's people. God obviously gave it to Moses and he gave it to God's people. So he's really the one that we would look to as kind of the author, if you will, the human writer of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible. So they would say, so he's asking them, listen, what did the one who gave you the law, what did he say? And he comes in, what he's trying to do is he's bringing them back here in verse 4. You'll see that they said, and they remembered, they know exactly because they know the law. He's bringing them back to Deuteronomy chapter 24. And that's what they essentially are quoting here. Verse 4 says, and they said, Moses suffered or allowed to write a bill of divorcement and to put her away. In other words, they asked Jesus, is it right for a man to divorce? And Jesus says, well, what did Moses say? They go back to Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 1 through 4, and they quote the bill of divorcement clause. And there is a clause in there that essentially says, yes, you can put your wife away or divorce your wife. However, look at what Jesus answers here. Verse 5. Jesus answered and said unto them, for the hardness of your heart, he wrote this precept. He's saying to the people, you're right. Moses did allow for it, but think about why he's allowing for it. He's not allowing for it because divorce is good, divorce is right, divorce is always the right thing. If you go back, and I won't take the time now because I'm already talking a little long-winded here. I'm just self-conscious of that, but I want to encourage you, if you're interested in this, go back to Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 1 to 4, and you will look and see, just take my word for it now, but go back and study this. Jesus saying what the passage says is, yes, it is permitted, but notice it is for the protection of the woman. It is not written so that this man, a lot of times these pig-headed, bull-headed men can just have any which way they want and decide, you know what, I don't like the way she looks anymore, I'm getting rid of her. That was never the reason it was written. It was written, go back to Deuteronomy, and you'll see this. It was written as a protection measure so that if a man does that, she has some protection against men who would abuse this power. Now, to be fair, and this is what he said, for the hardness of your heart, there is a reality, and there's sin nature. We are broken people. There's a reality that marriage relationships don't always work out. Some of you, unfortunately, have lived through that, so you know that that's not just a concept; that's reality. So I think Jesus has even acknowledged it's reality, but he's also saying it's not ideal. And what the law is trying to do, and what Jesus is hearkening back to, is he's saying, listen, the law's whole point is not to permit you to do one thing or another, but to minimize the damage of sin. To minimize the damage, so that the little ones, and Jesus talks a lot about the little ones. Mark chapter 9 and verse 42 talks about the little ones. But he's trying to make sure the little ones are not damaged, the little ones, the overlooked, the abused. And in this case, again, I mean no disrespect to any women that are listening to me or any women in the world, but in this culture, the little ones would have included women because they would have had no legal power, no power against a man who decides he's just going to, treat a woman any old way. And Jesus is saying, listen, I'm not going to give you loopholes of you can walk through and do what you want to do. Instead, I want you to understand that your marriage ultimately is not about you. You see, if you're a disciple of Jesus Christ, I want to make sure you get this point. If you're a disciple of Jesus Christ, you have different goals. Your goals is not to be the happiest you can be. Your goal in life is not to get everything you want and make sure Jesus foots the bill. That's not the goal of the disciple. The goal of the disciple, you go to Mark chapter 8 and verse 34, it's to deny yourself and willingly march towards your death as you follow Jesus Christ. That's the goal of the disciple. We are literally going to take our rights, we're going to put them on the cross, and we're going to nail them there. That's what a disciple's goal is. We're even willing, Mark chapter 9, verses 43 through 48, we're even willing, if it takes it, to remove limbs, to take out eyeballs in order, take extreme measures in order to help other people. So going back to this conversation about divorce, if you're sitting there trying to, and we could apply this to a lot of things. I'll just take a little pet peeve of mine. This is just acknowledge that this is through Matthew's lens. But one I always get hung up on is people wanting to excuse alcohol drinking, alcoholism and drinking alcohol. And they want to excuse like, well, the Bible doesn't say you can't drink it. It's not a sin. Well, you're right. It doesn't say that. It's clearly not a sin on its own. But the overwhelming testimony of Scripture is saying it's dangerous, it's deceptive. You need to be careful, watch out for it. It's gonna make you a drunkard and also those sorts of things. And the same thing here is instead of looking at it to find a way to do what you want to do, Jesus is not allowing for that. He's saying, listen, the whole point of this divorce law was never so a man who doesn't want to be married anymore can just stop being married. The point of this was so that if a man was so pig-headed that he couldn't make it work with his wife, that woman would have some protection against his foolishness, essentially. The point I'm trying to get you to see is if you're a disciple of Jesus and you really want to follow him, we've got to stop looking for the loopholes. We have to see that this Jesus life is not about what we can get away with, what we can excuse, but instead giving up everything that we own for the sake of the gospel, for the sake of others, to the sake of serving other people. And we are about accepting and serving the least, not about trying to get the best for ourselves. So Jesus is first of all saying, I'm not a loopholes kind of teacher. I'm a no loopholes teacher. He's also a radical truth teacher. Radical meaning he goes back to the heart of the matter. He's not trying to add something or trying to get these edge issues. He's talking about the heart of the matter, which is why he goes back in verse 5. He says, the reason that Moses wrote that was because your hearts were hard, because you were a mess, and he's got to work around that mess. Verse 6, he says, but from the beginning, he's hearkening back to Moses because that's where these Pharisees would have went back to, was Moses. But he says, go back to the beginning, Genesis, the very beginning when God created man. He said, at the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. And for this cause, so he says, he made a man and woman, and for this cause shall a man leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife, and they twain shall be one flesh. Then they shall no more twain, but one flesh. What therefore God hath joined together, let not man put asunder. He goes all the way back to the beginning, and he says, listen, I hear what Moses was doing, and Moses was acting on my authority. This is my take on this. He says he's acting on my authority to make sure that women were protected. And he recognized the reality of the world and gave you some rules and regulations around that. However, if you go back to the way that the God of the universe, the standard bearer, the one who created all this, I made humanity. I made male and female, and I made marriage because it was good. If you go back to Genesis chapters 1 and 2, it was good. It was very good. God is the one who defines all of this, and he calls marriage a leave and cleave kind of institution. Leaving means leaving parents specifically. He talks about that, leaving father and mother, but leaving all these other things behind and cleaving, joining together with that other person. And when you do that, it's a transformative thing, he says. We're no longer talking about two people. In my case, Matthew and Vanessa. My wife's name's Vanessa. No longer Matthew and Vanessa. It's together. There's one flesh. There's one flesh. If these two fingers were to be fused together and they were to become one thing, could you take them apart? Of course, we can cut them, we can do it, but there's going to be damage done, and that's exactly what happens. And again, I appeal to some of you who, as you're thinking about this, or maybe you know people in your life that have experienced divorce, you know that that's not a victimless crime. There are people that are hurt. There are people that are damaged in that process. And he's saying, you're no longer two people, you're a unit, you're one thing. And ultimately, he said, what God put together, don't miss that. It's a God connected thing. This is, I think we think in this modern era that about marriage as a contract. You know, we sign the documents and it's something we do before the government. And just like any contract, there are out clauses and all that kind of thing. That's not how this thing works with marriage. It's actually a covenant that is testified to by three parties: the man, the woman, and God Himself. So it is actually God who is saying, I'm the one who's defining this thing. This is why I'm saying Jesus is a radical truth. He's not looking at and making calls about, well, maybe he was right, or maybe she was right, or maybe in this circumstance. No, no, no. He's going all the way back to the beginning and saying, God is the one who defines marriage. He's the one who unites man and woman together, and he's the one who calls the shots here. The message here for disciples of Jesus is the truth of what is right and what is wrong. And I know he's talking about marriage, but I think this is broader than that. The truth of what's right and wrong is not defined by the Supreme Court of the United States. It's not defined by Congress. It's not defined by your pastor, your preacher. It's not defined by your local government. It's not defined by the loudest voices at the protest line. It's not defined by who's got the bigger guns. It's not defined by any of those people. It's only defined not by any human being, not by any human or governmental institution. It's defined by God Himself. He is the standard bearer of truth. So if I'm a disciple of Jesus, I'm not following Jesus to get my truth and your truth or whoever. I'm following Jesus to learn of His truth, to learn of Him. It's not what I think, it's not what I feel, it's what God has said. Now, lastly, I want to point out here, and I've got to hurry along for the sake of time. I want to point out I'm going to go down to verse 10. And it says in the house, his disciples ask him again in the same manner. So Jesus had said his piece and counted to 10 and moved on. But the disciples, after he kind of gets them off to the side, and they do this from time to time. And I'd probably do this too. If I got to walk with Jesus day to day like they did, and he'd be talking to the crowds. And then when I got him off in the corner, I said, what did you mean by that? That's what they're doing to him there in verse 10. And then verse 11, he says, this is what I meant. He says, whosoever shall put away his wife, divorce his wife, and marry another, committeth adultery against her. And if a woman shall put away her husband, by the way, that this verse 12, radical in terms of the culture of that time. There was no real concept of a woman divorcing her husband, but Jesus, he was on the side of women and on the side of men. He wasn't a chauvinist, if you will. That's not how he saw it. But he said, if a woman put away her husband and be married to another, she committeth adultery. Jesus doubles down here. The disciples are wanting some details, but what Jesus is saying, listen, if you're trying to find loopholes, forget it. I'm not a loopholes teacher. If you're trying to find out what the new truth is, forget it. I'm going back to the original. I'm the definer of what truth is. You don't want to look for what the world thinks. You need to know what God has said and what He's set in stone. And He doubles down here and says, listen, at the end of the day, I'm against sin, because sin hurts, sin damages, sin damns. And He's not making exceptions here. He says, if a woman does it or a man does it, it hurts. There's no, well, he did it first or she was at fault. None of that's going on here. He's basically saying what Paul says in Romans 14, make no provision for the flesh. We're not managing our sin. We're doing what Paul says in Romans 8:13. We're killing our sin. And he calls unfaithfulness what it is. Now, I will point out to you, just to make sure I'm being clear and full holistic on this topic. Are there situations where there's abuse that's happening that a woman or a man, for that matter, need to get out of that relationship? Absolutely. Good gracious! If somebody's telling you to stay in a marriage that somebody's beating you or threatening your life or anything, good. Don't listen to them. That's not right and proper. I don't even think that's what Jesus is talking about here. If you've got a spouse who is consistently unfaithful and never faithful to that marriage, not being faithful to that marriage, while you certainly have a right and an opportunity to try to make amends and try to make that right. Um, I'm not sure that I'm going to advise you to stay in that marriage either, because those marriage vows have been broken. But ultimately, what he's saying here is, if there's just some people that say, you know what, we can't get along, we don't want to be together anymore, or I'd rather go to somebody else. He's calling that what it is, not a we've fallen out of love, or we just, we're going different none of these euphemisms. He's saying it's unfaithful, it's adultery. And he's hitting it on the head. And he's saying that sin causes pain, causes damage, and it needs to stop. Because if you're a disciple of Jesus, instead of explaining away our sin, what we're going to do is we're going to have a hard look at ourselves and say, listen, Matthew, what you're wanting is not whatever you've explained away, but what you're wanting is the lust in your heart, and you're pursuing that, and that's sin. That's what Jesus is doing here. He's saying, listen, you want to talk about rules and regulations and if then statements, you're missing the point. There's sin, it needs to be addressed. And I would dare say that at the heart of a lot of these situations with divorce, and again, I've not been through it myself, and I'm not judging your specific situation if you have endured that. But I can about guarantee you, on one side or the other, if not both, there's sin involved, and it needs to be addressed. Now, as I already told you, I want to make sure I say this real clear, because I know this is personal for a lot of people. Again, I believe the Bible does allow for, and it is probably the right thing in some cases. If there is unfaithfulness, or if there's abuse and things like that, let's not hurt ourselves. I don't think that's what we're talking about here. But anyway, ultimately, what if I want to get a divorce? Let's put it to you that way. You're a follower of Jesus. You want to get a divorce? I'm just going to put it to you plainly. I don't think Jesus is supporting of that under most circumstances. There's no loopholes. Love that person. Serve them more. He says he's the one that can break it. And again, I think the ways that the Lord has allowed for those marriage vows to be severed is, of course, death, adultery, and I believe in those cases where there's abuse, or there's someone that's hurting someone else, that those are probably appropriate to get out of. But ultimately, you're not free from your obligation, and therefore can go and enter into a new obligation because you just don't want to do that anymore. Not if you're a disciple of Jesus, because who are you following? Your heart? The world? No, we're following Jesus. He's a no loopholes preacher. He's a radical truth teacher. He's an against sin rabbi. That's the kind of person that we follow. And that applies, by the way, we're talking about divorce here, but it applies to every aspect of life. And that's what Jesus is going to teach us, to follow him. Now, I'm going to close here and simply say, I acknowledge that that's a very difficult topic personally for some people, especially if you've had to endure some pain of some past relationship. I hope I've not come across to you as insensitive to that, because I'm not at all. And I'm sorry that you've had to endure that. I would add to that simply is part of the human condition, just like some people have had to deal with physical pain, emotional pain, psychological, spiritual pain. This is a problem that this world has brought into your front step. But I'd like you to hear me beg you to prioritize following Jesus over what your feelings have. And by the way, I know I've not had to deal with that, so I feel a little hypocritical in talking to you as forcefully as I am. But I also want to acknowledge to myself and to you that while I've not had to endure the pain of divorce, I have my own lusts and own proclivities and own desires that I have to fight against. And I think that's true of every one of God's children and God's disciples, or Jesus' disciples. We have to prioritize following Jesus over the pain, the feeling, the hurt, the circumstances. And Jesus, he does love us. He cares for us, and he does. He's so. Aren't you glad he's so patient? Aren't you glad? Because I can tell you, even if you are you are the reason that you went. Maybe some of you went through a divorce because of your foolishness, and if that's you, aren't you glad God forgives and God loves and God cares for you? Isn't that wonderful? And I'd say the same thing, even if it's not your fault, it's someone else's fault. Aren't you glad God repairs? God builds us up. This is what he does for us. So I want to make sure I leave you with those thoughts, just because I know this is a sensitive topic for some people, and I just want you to know that I love you, but ultimately it doesn't matter if Matthew loves you, but I can tell you that the Lord does. Absolutely, positively, no questions. He loves you. I'm going to close there. I look forward to connecting with you all. I'm not going to be on here next week. It'll be a week, 2 weeks from now, but I will get this on the schedule and we will talk at least one more time before Thanksgiving. And good gracious, can you believe it's Thanksgiving time already? But anyway, y'all take care. Have a great evening, and we'll see you in about 2 weeks.